Right, hello everyone and welcome to this Data Week Online 2021 talk workshop even. Data Week Online is an interactive program of speakers and workshops showcasing the latest in data science and AI, and we've got a jam-packed program of events running all week. Can I have the next slide, please, Sasha? So just a little bit of admin before we get started. We are recording this session and it will be made available shortly after the event on YouTube. Please ensure that you've all read through the JGI Code of Conduct and Virtual Event Policy, which Chiara has just posted in the chat now. And one of the main things is, please can you keep your microphone muted unless you're invited to unmute it by the speaker, just for the comfort of all the other attendees. If you have any questions, Sasha will explain shortly, but please go ahead and type them into the chat box as well as we go through. We'd also be really grateful if you could fill in the registration form for this event, which is a very quick two question form just to gather a little bit of information about who's here. There's a link to that in the chat now as well that Chiara has posted. And as I say, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as well. Next slide, please. So just a very quick introduction to the Gene Golding Institute and what we're all about. My name's James Thomas and I'm a data scientist at the Institute. And we are the central hub for data science and data intensive research at the University of Bristol. We're one of 5 university research institutes. And our job is to connect multidisciplinary experts across the university and beyond. And we work in 4 priority work streams, as you can see on the left-hand side: societal challenges, data visualization, reproducibility and data governance, which seems sort of quite apt for the workshop session that we've got now, and fundamental research. And we have a number of activities that we do to help promote these work streams. One of them, developing communities, is what we're doing now during Data Week. Next slide, please. So as I said, we have lots of events on this week. I think it's about 40 in there. There is, if you are interested in any of the others, there's an interactive timetable that you can go and find on our website at the bottom of the screen there, bristol.ac.uk/Golding. And if you load this as a PDF, any of the events you can click on, it will take you straight through to the registration page if you want to find out more and join one of the events. So if you like this event, I encourage you to check out some of the other ones we have. Yeah, next one, please. So just a quick shout out to our collaborators and sponsors for Data Week Online, without whom it wouldn't have been possible to run this event for free. So it's far too many to mention individually, but thanks very much to all of them. They're all on the screen there. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So we'd really like people to connect with us as much as possible over Data Week Online. So there's a few ways you can do that. Probably the easiest way is on Twitter to use the hashtag Bristol Data Week, or you can mention us at JGI Bristol. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. And there's a number of other ways to stay in touch with what we're doing. I think one of the best ones that I found is our regular newsletter that's sent out. And if you go onto our website, you can find more details there. There's also a data ethics club that we run every 2 weeks, which is a number of talks and workshop sessions that we run, and that's perhaps might be interesting to you as well. So I encourage you to go on the website and check that out. Chiara's also put the links to those in the chat. Thanks, Chiara. And next slide, please. So one final slide from me, just to plug another event that we've got. We have our Gene Golding Institute Showcase early next year in February, and that will be in the iconic M-Shed building on the harbour side. It'll be open to the public, family friendly, lots of speakers, exhibitions, and opportunities to connect. So if you like what's gone on this week, then I really encourage you to have a look at that event when more details come out soon. So that's everything from me. Just all that is left for me to do now is introduce our speaker for this workshop. Essentials of working with sensitive research data. So Zosha Beckles is an experienced information professional with a background in health informatics and research data management in the higher education and research sectors. She's been a chartered member of the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals since 2012 and is currently part of the Library Research Support at the University of Bristol, where she specializes in providing training and support to academics in research metrics, bibliometrics, and sensitive research data management, including the launch of a new dataset disclosure risk assessment service to facilitate safe publication of sensitive data. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the content of this workshop. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Zosha.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, James. Okay, so I will dive straight in. What I will say is this is going to, by necessity, be fairly top level. So it'll be a kind of lightning tour of stuff that you need to know about to deal with sensitive data properly. I'm sure you'll probably have questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. If we run out of time to get through any of them, my contact details, well, the contact details of my team will be included in these slides, which will go out afterwards. And absolutely feel free to follow up with anything that we don't get time to cover today. Okay, so first of all, a kind of overview of what I'm going to talk about. Firstly, I'm going to start off with just a kind of quick overview of what we mean when we talk about sensitive data. Then I'll dive into what the kind of things you need to think about when you're planning a project with sensitive data. I'll brief diversion into consent forms and participant information sheets, because these are things that it's really critical to get right, because that can have a huge impact on what you can do with the data further on down the line. Then I'll talk a bit about issues around secure data collection, and in particular the tools and facilities that are available to support that at the University of Bristol. If you're not a member of the University of Bristol, obviously some of the specifics won't apply to you, but hopefully generalities will still be useful. And then lastly, I'm going to close with some information on things you need to think about when it comes to sharing sensitive data and how you can do that safely and securely whilst still protecting the privacy and the confidentiality of the data subject. And again, some of the specifics of what I'll talk about will be unique to Bristol, but again, the kind of the generalities will still apply. And then lastly, hopefully if we've got time, we'll do some Q&A. But as I said, if not, please do feel free to follow up offline via email. Okay, so firstly, what do we mean by sensitive data? So the first thing to bear in mind is that it can be any type of data can potentially be sensitive. So qualitative, interviews, videos, photos, this kind of thing. Quantitative, so you know, numbers about people. If you're writing code, there could potentially be sensitive data in there, depending on, for example, whether you've got variable names in there, or in fact specific data elements in there as well. And of course, you know, different formats of quantitative data, so spreadsheets, things like that. So the important thing just to kind of bear in mind is that it doesn't really matter what data you've got, it could potentially contain sensitive information. So you need to kind of bear that in mind. The second thing is that there are different types of sensitivity. What this workshop is going to focus on is ethical sensitivity. So that's sensitivity relating to identifiable people or potentially at-risk species, if your work involves at-risk species and there's information that could identify the locations, say, of members of those species, then that could potentially be ethically sensitive. But for the most part, we're talking about personal data belonging to people when we talk about ethical sensitivity. But you could also have things like commercial sensitivities, so around intellectual property. There could be issues of national security or legal considerations if you're, for example, if you're working with collaborative partners and there's issues around data ownership. So these are other things that you need to bear in mind. And there are lots of different teams at the university that can support you if those are issues. And I'll kind of touch on some of those later on. But as I said, for the most part, this workshop is going to focus on ethical sensitivities. Okay, so the kind of first big thing that I want to talk about is planning for working with sensitive data. And if you've ever been to any research data management workshops before, you'll probably have been hit over the head multiple times with the data management plan back. And I'm going to do it again, I'm sorry. Essentially, this is one of the most important things that you can do to make your project run smoothly with regards to sensitive data. Essentially, what these plans should do is cover what data you're going to create, how you're going to document it, describe it, how you're going to store it, preserve it for the long term, and what plans you have to make it available to other researchers or to the general public if possible, after the fact. Most funders will require one as part of the application process, so you kind of may have to do one anyway. But even if your funder doesn't, or your project is self-funded, it's still a really good idea to do one, because particularly if you're working with sensitive data, because a lot of the issues that you're going to have to deal with regards to data protection, GDPR, and so and those sorts of things will be addressed by necessity when you're creating a data management plan. So they'll kind of fall out of that. So it can really, really help you to kind of get on top of these things. So I won't go through all of these questions in detail, because each kind of template for a data management plan will address these slightly differently. But essentially, these are the sorts of questions that any data management plan will have you answer. And the key areas that you want to think about for sensitive data are going to be storage. So where are you going to store the data, and who's going to have access to it during the lifetime of the project? And then sharing. So what are you going to share with other people at the end of the project? How are you going to do that? And whether or not you need to apply access restrictions, or whether you can share it openly. So those are kind of the two key areas that you want to think about if you're dealing with sensitive data. Right. So before I move on to the next section, a quick plug for DMP Online. It's a slightly clunky website, but it does a really important task, which is pull together templates for all the major UK and EU funding bodies for data management plans. So if you're working with Horizon, ESRC, any of the UKRI funding bodies, their templates will all be on this website. You can use the website. You can create your plan in the website, and it's got some sort of context-sensitive help and things like that. Or you can just download a blank copy of the template and work offline. So you can use it however you want. It's a really, really useful resource for those templates. And they have a team that makes sure they're always up to date as well. So you don't have to worry that you're getting an old version. Okay, so moving on from data management plans, I'm going to talk a bit now about GDPR and the Data Protection Act. So I just realised that I should have changed that will to do still apply after Brexit, alas. But yeah, essentially both GDPR and the Data Protection Act, you still have to know about them, you still have to abide by them. We're currently now under something called UK GDPR, but and it may well diverge from the EU GDPR, but for the time being, they're basically exactly the same bits of legislation. So the same issues, the same rights and responsibilities and things like that all still apply. What these bits of legislation do is essentially set out your data subjects, your research participants' rights with regards to their personal data and your responsibilities if you're working with that personal data. What we mean by personal data is things like names and addresses, online identifiers, so email addresses, IP addresses, that sort of thing, but also things like economic information, so tax bracket, income, that sort of thing. Also things around culture and social identity, you know, what kind of communities people belong to, this sort of thing. So it can cover both sort of quite concrete things, so like names, and also fairly nebulous things like physical attributes, that sort of thing. The important thing is that it's considered personal information if it can be used to identify a specific living individual. So if you're working with data that relates to people that are already dead, then none of this applies. And if your data is properly anonymized, then again, GDPR doesn't apply. And I'll talk a bit more later on about what properly anonymized means or doesn't mean. The other thing to bear in mind is that sort of within the class of personal data, there's a special category data, which is information that's considered to be sort of so sensitive and so potentially harmful to the data subjects if it was released without proper precautions, that you have to take special care of it, essentially. So this is, and you know, and these are fairly obvious categories. So information about people's health, sex, life, sexual orientation, trades union membership, race, politics, so on, get kind of fairly obvious stuff. And that means that, as I said, if you are dealing with this sort of stuff, you need to take extra care with it. And I'll talk a bit more later on about the conditions that you have to meet to be able to deal with special category data. So the kind of first thing to bear in mind is that if you're processing personal data, you have to have a lawful basis to do so. So this means one of these 6 reasons on the screen, and you can use any of them. Each of them have sort of benefits and disbenefits with regards to kind of flexibility and how easy they are to apply. I'm not going to go into the details of all of these because most of them are not relevant for you if you're dealing with personal data in a research context. What the University of Bristol recommends is that you use the public task lawful basis for data processing, because the university charter gives our researchers a legal basis for performing research in the public interest. And there's the relevant clause down there. Not that you need to cite it, it's just there for kind of information. You can also use consent, and that is also absolutely fine. The one thing I will say about that is that you need to be clear that consent to process data under GDPR and consent to participate in a study, so ethical consent, are 2 different things. And you need to make sure that you're not conflating those in your patient information sheet and your consent forms, so that your participants are not confused about what they are agreeing to and what they are able to withdraw from, because you may want them to be able to withdraw from the study, but you still want to be able to keep processing their data, for example. And whilst you can still do that with consent, it's it just kind of becomes a bit more complicated, and you have to be a bit more careful about how you lay these things out. So as I said, that's one of the reasons why we recommend a public task, because that kind of immediately separates those 2 issues out completely. As I said, I'll talk a bit more about consent forms and that sort of thing later on. Okay, so once you've got your legal basis for processing data and you're satisfied that you're processing it for a proper reason, the data subjects will still have certain rights. Now, for the most part, everybody, including you or I as data subjects in our own lives, would have all of these 8 rights. But if you as a researcher are processing data for research purposes, then you can basically set aside everything but the first and the last of these data subject rights. So you still have to make sure that you inform participants about what data you're collecting and how you're going to use it. And you also have to inform them of any automated individual decision-making or automated profiling. And they need to be given the right to challenge such decisions. What this means is that if you are, for example, carrying out some research that will say, give people a course of treatment based on, we'll take certain characteristics into an algorithm and then spit out a recommended course of treatment, then your participants would have to be made aware that that's how their treatment decision was being made, and be given a chance to opt out of that and have a human being make that decision. Sort of a non-health example would be if decisions on mortgages mortgage eligibility were being made by machine. People would have to be given the right to opt out of that and have an actual banker make that decision. This sort of thing. It doesn't apply to randomization, just in terms of randomizing people into different arms. That's still fine. It's more this kind of using, because that wouldn't really use their personal data to make randomization decisions. This is where you're using their personal data and making a decision that has a real world impact on that person. So that's what that 8th one refers to. As I said, if you're working with personal data for research purposes, you can basically ignore all of the other ones apart from those 2. How do you show that you're working with data for research purposes? So there are kind of 3 key principles that you need to bear in mind. That's these 3 points in the middle. So firstly, you need to minimize the data that you collect. So don't just kind of collect data with the sort of, oh, well, it might come in useful attitude. You need to be sure, you need to have a concrete purpose for everything that you collect. Ideally, you want to anonymize as much as possible, as early as possible. Partly this is so that once the data is anonymized, it's no longer personal data, and then all these things don't apply. But also it's kind of, it will save you a lot of time if you're working with anonymized data versus having to do all this stuff at the end of your project to get it ready for publication. And then lastly, the third one, which I sort of referenced in the previous slide, is if you are doing any sort of study with this kind of automated decision making, then you need to make sure you've got the appropriate ethical approvals, either from a university rec or from an NHS rec, for example. And if you've met those principles and you're processing data for research purposes, then you can work with special category data. So you can work with health data, with data on trade union membership and all these kinds of things. And again, you can set aside those, the majority of those data subject rights, apart from informing people about what you're going to do with their data and not carrying out automated decision making. So as I said, so the bottom of this screen just kind of is a reiteration of that. Apart from the third point, which is that if participants can be identified in published results, then you need to make sure that you have retained enough information and retained the data in such a way that they can request access to it if they want. The best way to give an example of this is probably if you are, for example, quoting people directly, like making attributable quotations in published research, then you need to make sure that you keep the original transcripts or the original audio, say, of where they said those things, so that people can ascertain that, yes, that is what I said. If they can't be anonymous, if they can't be identified, so if they're anonymous quotes, or you've published anonymized data in any other way, then that third one doesn't apply because they can't be identified. So you literally can't trace them back to the data that's been published. Again, another reason for anonymizing as much as possible, as early as possible, because it removes the likelihood that you're going to be subject to these sorts of requests. Right. So the next thing to note is that you need to document your data processing. So this is making sure that you've noted down somewhere what the legal basis is for working with data, working with personal data, and the condition for processing your special category data, which is going to be for research purposes. You need to note what personal and special category data you're collecting, and you need to note who's going to have access to it, how long it's going to be kept for, who it's going to be shared with. But as I mentioned before, this is all the stuff that will fall out of your data management plan. So that's kind of, you've ticked all the boxes there already if you've created a data management plan. If you don't want to use a data management plan, or you just want to know exactly what to include in a privacy notice, there is an Information Commissioner's checklist link at the bottom of the page, which will take you to a really useful checklist that will help you tick off what to include in a privacy notice. This is essentially the sort of stuff that you would have in your participant information sheet. So it's not like you have to produce extra documentation. It's just kind of different things, sorry, the same thing called with different names essentially, but it's all the same information that you kind of would have been recording anyway. Right. One last thing to note with regards to newish GDPR requirements is privacy impact assessments. So for the most part, most research projects won't need to do one of these, but if you are working with say medical records, criminal records, if you're doing any kind of automated profiling, if you're systematically monitoring public spaces, so working with CCTV, or doing very large scale medical research, or working with vulnerable groups, then you probably will need to do a privacy impact assessment. The university's information governance manager has produced a sort of guide to filling one of these out, and so they're the people to contact about this. As I said, most studies won't need to do this, but if you're dealing with those sorts of high risk data, then do kind of at least read through what the requirements are with that. Okay, So now on to one of the fun parts, consent. So this is kind of what I mentioned earlier. Essentially, the issue that is often conflated here is ethical consent to participate in a study and consent to data processing under GDPR. These aren't the same thing. And whilst you could sort of smush them into a single clause in a consent form, it will likely confuse participants because they can withdraw from the study, but does that mean that that they also withdraw consent for data processing? Does that mean you then have to delete their data? They'd probably assume that that's what the case was. So you need to sort of tease these. I think it's a lot clearer if these things are teased apart. The other issue is that you need to separate research data and personal information needed for admin purposes in your consent and information sheets, because you're probably going to do quite different things with these different types of data. So, for example, your research data will probably be shared with other researchers after the fact, but the admin, so the contact details, email addresses, so on and so forth, you're unlikely to share those with other people. And so you should be clear with participants exactly what you're going to do with each of these types of data. And also, as I mentioned before, be clear on what's going to happen to data if a participant withdraws, because you probably want to keep processing their research data, but it might be reasonable to delete their personal information, or it might be reasonable to keep it. But as I said, you do just need to be clear with the participants about what exactly is going to happen. Just a quick example as to why this matters. So these are two clauses from the same consent form. First one, I understand that my data will be kept confidential and that only the research team will be able to access information about me. And then the second form, the second clause, I understand that the data may be used by other researchers. So those are kind of directly contradictory. It's probably clear to researchers and people that work in research support that the first clause refers to that personal information about names, addresses, contact details, and the second clause refers to research data, probably anonymized. But will the participants understand that? It's quite unclear. So this is why it's quite important to make sure that you're clear about the different types of data that you're referring to in each case and what you intend to do with those different types of data. As an example about how this has been made a little bit clearer, in the first clause, I understand that health professionals and members of the research team will have access to my personal information, including content information and other direct identifiers. So that kind of gives an example of what is meant by personal information and also specifies who's going to have access to that. And then with the second examples, the research data results may be made available as open data. However, any personal information on me will be removed or changed before the files are shared with other researchers. So again, that kind of goes a little way to explaining a bit more clearly what is meant by research data and in what way it's going to be shared with others. And the two different clauses there are one is sharing openly with anyone and one would be sharing just with other researchers. And there's a link at the bottom there for example templates that you can use. Okay, so that was a lightning tour through GDPR and consent. What I'll talk about now briefly is issues around data collection. So the idea here is that you want to kind of bake in privacy and security from the point of data collection. So there's no point during your data processing process, that was awkward, where you're storing data or dealing with it or analyzing it on something that's not secure. So this means, or it might mean using an encrypted device for collecting data in the field and then transferring it to some sort of secure backup storage as soon as possible. If you're using just services for transcription, scanning and video conferencing and so on, you need to make sure that those services have been checked for that they've got appropriate data protection agreements in place. They've got appropriate information security. So the reason why we advise you to use the University of Bristol's approved services, and they're all in the link there, is because those checks have taken place. Somebody in IT services, finance, and secretary's office has kind of gone through the service level agreement with each of these services and checked that they're only storing data locally. It's not being transferred into cloud services, so which can be stored anywhere around the world rather than just in the UK or the EU. They are, they make sure that these services are not doing anything onward with the data. So, for example, if you're using an automated transcription service, these things are great, but they may also be using your data for machine learning purposes to improve their own systems, which is like great, fine for them, but obviously that has implications about the security of the data that you're giving them. So yeah, these are the things that kind of you need to be aware of. And I'm not saying don't use those services, but if you are going to use a service that hasn't already been pre-approved, then you need to make sure that you've thought about these things and you're satisfied with the answers that those services are giving you. And that can be pretty complicated to establish, which is why, as I said, why we recommend that you only use the ones that have been already approved. So in terms of video conferencing, Zoom is the platform that's recommended for conducting interviews with research participants, but I would recommend that you store video, if you're recording it, store the video locally rather than in the cloud. More for security than anything else, but as in backups. But yeah, it's kind of, again, it's an issue. It does also go towards that, knowing exactly where your data is thing. But if you're just thinking about communicating with other collaborators, then yeah, you can use any system that you like. Bristol Medical School has the REDCap platform for secure online collection of survey data. That does come with a cost, so you would have to factor that into grant budgets, but you can contact them directly if you'd like to know more about that. And as I mentioned before, make sure that you're storing personal data, so your admin data, email addresses, names, and so on, separately to the research data, so that you've got that separation between the two types of data, and it makes it easier. And it reduces the risk if one type of information is, if somebody accesses one type of information when they shouldn't, it doesn't mean they've got access to everything. Okay, right, so other things to think about are, as I mentioned, minimizing the amount of data that you collect. It's good practice anyway for data protection reasons, but it also means that you've kind of got less to deal with, less to anonymize later on. So think about what are the minimum variables that you need to answer the research question that you've got, but also what level of precision do you need? Do you need the full date of birth? Would just the year do, or the month and year? If you're dealing with geographical information, do you need the full postcode or just the outcode work? Can you mask identifiers at the point of collection? So if you're interviewing someone, can you use a pseudonym right from the beginning, rather than having to go back through and anonymize the transcript? This sort of thing. I mean, some of these things are not going to be possible, or not practical, but think about them in advance and think about what you can front load in terms of doing that work. Okay, so in terms of storing sensitive data, and again, apologies to anyone who isn't from Bristol, this is going to be fairly Bristol focused. What we recommend at the university is, firstly, the research data storage facility. So this is a secure petabyte scale facility that is specifically for long-term private storage of research data. You can apply for up to 5 terabytes free as a PI, and you can grant access to anyone in your local Bristol research team, but also to external collaborators as well. If you're not using that, then any backed up network and backed up UAB drive would do, including OneDrive, SharePoint OneDrive. What I will say is that SharePoint and OneDrive are not really suitable for long-term data storage, because obviously as soon as you leave university, your OneDrive will go. But whilst you're working on a project, as long as you're properly encrypting files with sensitive information, then absolutely you can use those services. What we don't recommend is any other cloud service. So as I kind of alluded to before, this is mainly because you just don't know where that data is being stored. with the university provided services, again, you've got the assurance that the university has checked these things beforehand. And then finally, sort of single point of failure personal storage. If it's part of your wider backup plan, then obviously that's fine. But yeah, don't be this poor person with the laptop lost on the bus. It's a sad tale. Right, so no, okay, sorry, I thought I skipped a slide, but no. Okay, so I've talked a bit about planning, about your consent and participant information sheets, a quick overview of issues around data collection. So now I'm going to talk about data sharing, and yeah, okay, I think I'm heading on to wrap up about the right time. The issue here is that there are kind of two main ways that you can share data. You can share it openly, so anyone can download the data without any restrictions, or you can share it with some sort of access restrictions. Both have advantages and disadvantages. Open data is, obviously you'll get a lot more use of your data if it's openly available. And you can apply a license to limit what people can do with your data. So for example, the Creative Commons license that I've quoted there, it requires people to attribute the data set to you, to not use it commercially, and if they share it onwards, to apply the same Creative Commons license. But you're essentially relying on goodwill pretty much to enforce those, because it's really, really hard to keep track of who's got the data and what they're doing with it. If you have more concerns about what people are doing with your data, then it's probably going to be more appropriate to apply some sort of restricted access data release to it. So this is where you'd have a metadata record that's freely available, so people can find the data set and see what's in it, or at least see that it exists and a brief description on it, but they can't actually access the files themselves. The way people request data is via an independent, transparent and appealable process, ideally. And the terms of reuse of the data are contractually enforced. So that's kind of much stronger in terms of safeguarding what people can do with the data. So there are a couple of different options that you've got in terms of platforms that will support you to do this. The University of Bristol Research Data Repository exists, and we offer both open and restricted access to data sets. And that service is supported by my team. So we can kind of, if you've not sort of gone through this before, we'll be there to support you the whole way through. There are also commercial repositories. So you've probably come across some of these before, so Figshare, Zenodo, so on and so forth. Most of these usually only offer open access, but they are usually very easy to use. And one benefit is that they will be, some of them can be integrated with the manuscript submission process. So it can kind of be pretty seamless to submit your manuscript and your supporting data all at the same time. But as I said, they will usually only offer open access, so do bear that in mind. But the kind of what's usually the kind of the best option is a disciplinary data repository. So these are repositories that specialize in a particular kind of data or data on a particular subject. Some will offer controlled access, so like the UK Data Service has a very good controlled access scheme. They will usually be a bit more fussy about how you submit your data, so what formats, structures and documentation accompany the data set, but they do usually have pretty good user support, again, to guide you through that process. If you're not sure whether or not there is a relevant repository for you, the read3data.org link at the bottom of the screen is a searchable directory of research data repositories across the world. So you can search by subject as well, or by country, or there's a lot of different ways to filter. So I would definitely recommend having a look at that if you're not sure. But if there isn't a suitable repository there, then I said, if you're at the University of Bristol, you can always deposit with us. The university repository accepts any sort of data set on any sort of subject. So if there isn't a specific one for you, then please do come to us. Okay, so just kind of brief warning here about, and I kind of alluded to this previously, if you leave all of the kind of data prep, anonymization and so on activities to the very end of the project, it can be a real headache. It can take a very long time. So as much as you can front load, I would strongly recommend that you do. And make sure that you include data curation costs in your budget. So that's not just costs for data storage if you need to buy more, but also you know, staff time to do that, because as I said, it can take quite a long time. Just a very brief couple of guides on organizing data. So we have a 1-minute guide to file organization. It really is 1 minute, it's just a single page. And that kind of gives you kind of pointers to files that will do sort of programs that will do batch file renaming and things like that for you. There's a really useful list of recommended formats for long-term data storage at the bottom of the screen. And again, this is if you can work with those formats from the beginning, then that's that can save you a bit of time. But absolutely work with whatever suits you, suits your work, and just sort of convert them at the end of your project, because that is usually a fairly quick process. Okay, so again, just briefly, most repositories will want you to submit a README file at the very least. So this is things like a list of what's in the data set, what dependencies, you know, what software requirements there are to make use of it. But some repositories, so for example, the UK Data Service will require something a bit more in-depth. So say a data dictionary, they might require you to use certain data or metadata standards. If you're not aware of a well-used standard in your field, that probably means there isn't one. But you can look up standards, data and metadata standards at fairshowing.org at the bottom of the screen there, because then you may find some that you haven't come across before and could be really useful. So for example, the OME XML is an open microscopy environment standard, which allows microscopy imagery files to be shared across different systems, and keeps all of the metadata associated with how that image was captured in a separate XML file, which, as you can imagine, given all the sort of additional stuff that you need to know in order to make use of those files, is really, really useful. Right, so I think that's everything I wanted to say on documentation. So the last couple of slides are going to be on issues around disclosure risk and anonymization. And basically, the kind of what I just want to flag up is that you'd be surprised at how disclosive your data can be. It doesn't, even if you've removed all the direct identifiers, so names and so on, some things like that, indirect identifiers can still be enough to identify people. So if you imagine that you've got some census microdata and it's got household size and some information on location, and you had a very big household in a very tiny village somewhere, those 2 bits of information alone would be enough to identify that one household. I mean, that's kind of an extreme, but those are the things that you kind of need to be aware of. And there are different kinds of disclosure risks. So if you have images, there might be geotagging in the metadata, which would give you information on where that photo was taken. So even if you blurred out the people's faces, knowing where that photo was taken could be enough to identify people, or at least it could be when taken into context with other information that's out there. If you've got interview transcripts, as well as sort of taking out information about the participant, it's also good to think about what are they talking about, what other information are they revealing about third parties, say, in the interview. Can your data set be linked to other data sets? I mean, that's kind of a how long is a piece of string question, because the answer is going to almost certainly be yes, but it would be incredibly difficult. But, you know, if you're releasing data slices of a larger project, then almost certainly people could make links between different data slices, and even if you've kind of sort of successfully anonymized one slice, when you put them together, would that be enough to identify people? And also just sort of things like you may not mention anything about location in your data set itself, but in your protocol or your manuscript, you may talk about where people were recruited from. And, you know, depending on what the particular population is you're studying, again, that could be enough to be quite disclosive. So, for example, you're collecting data on victims of domestic violence from a particular clinic, who've attended a particular clinic, and you may not make any mention of location in the data set, but you know, you've got information on, say, how many children these people have and what kind of job they do, say, and then when you link that with the information on the clinic that is in the manuscript or the protocol, then you've suddenly got much more information about where this particularly vulnerable group could be located. So these are the kinds of things that you need to be aware of. Yeah, okay, so in terms of thinking about how to reduce that disclosure risk, what I'm going to talk about now is a couple of different ways to, the sort of three main ways that we can think about anonymisation. And essentially, these are kind of the main thing you want to be thinking about. One of the main things is the likely environment the data set is going to be used in. So what other knowledge are people likely to have, and how controlled is the access to that data set going to be? Are there going to be restrictions on people's behaviour when they're using it, essentially? So the first thing you can do is formal anonymisation, which is just sort of redacting names, blurring faces and other identifiable information in videos and so on, breaking links between data sets. So if people have a unique identifier that follows them from data set to data set, can you remove that and just give them a random identifier? So that's kind of formal anonymisation. So I'm leaping through these slightly because I'm aware of the time. But if you do want to pick up any of this in more detail, again, please do get in touch with me after the fact. And I will circulate the slides so you can follow the links and investigate these things on your own time as well. So the other option is, or another option is statistical anonymisation, which it would be where we try and change the nature of quantitative data such that it's less likely that people could be identified from it. So sort of one of the most common ways of doing this is to ensure that there's a minimum threshold of records which have the same combination of indirect identifiers. So, you know, there's at least 3 men in Glasgow who were plumbers, say, in your data set, so that there's that set of indirect identifiers is not enough to identify any single individual. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can aggregate variables. So, for example, if you had geographical information about specific areas in Glasgow, you could group that all together as just from Glasgow. You could do top and bottom coding. My Glaswegian plumber example doesn't really work with that, but yeah, so this would be where you'd cut off outliers at the top or the bottom. So, you know, say if you had just 1 or 2 people who were over 75, you could just recode them as 75 plus, and things like that. And there's a couple of different software packages that can help with that. I particularly like SDC Micro, which is an R package. It's got a graphical user interface, so you don't need to know coding in R, and it will guide you through doing a lot of these things, and you can undo them as well, so you don't need to worry that you're messing up your data set irrevocably. But yeah, so there are a couple of other packages as well, but that's the one that I recommend. Right, so the last thing that you can do is functional anonymisation, and this is what I was talking about when I was talking about what's the data environment. So if you are doing functional anonymisation, you're controlling how people can use the data. So you could either do this via applying a data access agreement or use a license that's contractually enforced, or you can offer access to data via a data haven, so some sort of safeguarded space where people can, they have to be vetted before they can access it. They can only work with the data within that safe space, and whatever they take away has been vetted for disclosure risk. there are places that will offer that kind of service. So again, the UK Data Service offers that for, I think they specialise in economic and social science data. I can't think of. There's some other safe havens for health data, but kind of UK Data Service is the main one for smaller data sets if you're not, working with NHS data. But in terms of applying a data access agreement, that's kind of a much less technical way to achieve more or less the same thing. Well, similar effect anyway, in terms of protecting the way the data is used. And that's something that we offer at the university's research data repository. And we've got some sample agreements, so you can see the kinds of things that are protected in a data access agreement. So it's things like you can't re-identify participants, you've got to destroy the data at the end of the study, this sort of thing. But I said, have a look at the text of the agreement if that's something you're interested in. And one thing I will flag up is this is a really interesting demo site at the bottom of the screen. This study basically looked at how many attributes it would take to uniquely identify people from a set of census microdata, and it was not very many at all. And you can, in fact, sort of see what it would take to identify yourself in UK with UK microdata by sort of entering, saying, well, I'm this age, I live in this postcode area, and so on. And you, like, I think the last time I did it, I think I only required sort of 4 attributes to be uniquely identified. So this is what I'm talking about. You might think that your data is anonymized, but it probably isn't. So it may be, even if you can apply these anonymization techniques to it, it might also be worth applying a data access agreement, a data license as well, just as a kind of belt and braces approach, because, as I said, how anonymized is anonymized? The answer is not very, usually. And if you can make it completely anonymized, it may not actually be useful to other researchers. So, those are the things you're weighing up, essentially. Now, the next couple of slides are on the different areas, the different sort of support services that we offer. So I won't go through these in detail because I want to make sure that we've got enough time for questions. And I said I will circulate these slides after the fact. So in fact, these are all guidance, help available. Yeah, there you go. So in fact, I'm going to skip straight through to the good stuff and move on to Q&A. Did any questions come up in the chat?
We have had, yes. Sasha, thank you very much for a really informative and interesting talk. And I feel that there's quite a lot of sort of gnarly bits of information here that you have to know. And yes, if you don't know, you could very easily miss something. And it's possibly something that people need to think about earlier on in the process than they actually do sometimes. So I have had some questions in. So I'll just start with a quick one that came in from a student at the dental school who said, and I think you probably answered this in one of the previous slides that you showed right at the end. Do you know how I can access an encrypted voice recorder for my qual research?
Yes, so the Research Data Service does actually have one that we can loan out. And I think we have just reopened the loan service now that the university buildings are starting to slowly reopen a bit. So I would drop an email to the data-bris email address, which is there, third line down on the screen now. So yeah, drop a line to us at that email address, and we'll let you know if it's available. And if not, we may be able to point you to somebody at your school who may have some. But yeah, drop us an email and we'll see what we can do.
We've had another question in, which is a sort of a 3-part question. Does anonymized data used in research need to be retained for the retention period required by the university? And maybe I'll ask them in separate bits, if you like.
Yeah, so yes, essentially, I mean, the kind of there's almost two different issues here. It's like if it's anonymized, then sort of GDPR data protection issues around how long you can retain personal information for don't really apply. So we would kind of advise that you keep valuable research data sort of almost indefinitely, and that's sort of why we have the RDSF, why we have the data.brist research data repository, so that we can keep that, so we can keep data securely for the long term. And I would almost say that's why it's not a particularly good idea to say, you know, we'll retain this data for anonymized data for, you know, 10 years and then destroy it, because A, you're kind of just creating admin for yourself at the end of 10 years, or for someone at the end of 10 years. And also, you know, maybe it'll be useful beyond that 10 years. And if it is anonymized, then you absolutely can keep it indefinitely. Yeah, so I think I'm not sure the university has a specific retention period for research data. It's sort of, I think we might recommend 10 years, but a lot of it will depend on what your funder requires and so on. So yeah, so if it's anonymized, I would advise keeping it for as long as you can and using one of these services that will allow you to keep it for the long term.
And I just leap into a question that someone's asked in the chat. They're just asking about phrasing indefinite data storage on an ethics application. Do you have any sort of suggestions for how you go about wording that?
Again, I mean, I think as long as you're, yeah, I mean, if the data is anonymized, then there aren't issues about keeping personal data because it's not personal data. So just sort of, you know, I think using words like long term for future research, I don't think you have to be specific if you're clear that it's the research data, anonymized research data that you're referring to that's going to be kept for the long term and, you know, potentially indefinitely. You do absolutely would want to put limits on how long you're keeping identifiable data for, because yeah, because also, I mean, there's probably going to be a limit of time beyond which the identifiers that you have are not going to be accurate anymore. So, you know, addresses and so on, people move, and so why would you want to keep that information if it's out of date? But yeah, I think with regards to if you're clear about the kind of data that you're intending to keep indefinitely, it shouldn't be a problem to say for the long term. You know.
Brilliant, thanks. And I think we've probably got time just to squeeze in one more question, which kind of neatly follows on from that. If you are anonymizing some personal data, one person asked, do you need to dispose or destroy the non-anonymized data set, the data set including the personal data straight away, or can you hold on to both data sets? And they are specifically, can the same person hold on to both data sets, but then there's a risk of kind of re-identification?
Yes, you can hold on to both data sets, but as you say, that would mean that if there is any way of sort of linking the anonymized data set back to the one with the identifiers, you know, if you've got patient IDs or something, you know, study IDs in there that link the two data sets, then the anonymized one is only pseudonymized and should really be treated the same as the one with the personal information in it. So you can absolutely retain both. If the link's been completely broken, then you can treat them sort of separately, and the anonymized one, as I said, doesn't count as personal data under GDPR, so you can basically do what you like with it, bearing in mind issues around disclosure risk that may just be inherent in the nature of the data set. But for the version with personal information in it, you can't keep it indefinitely, but you could keep it for longer, for example, to do further research on it, say, or just, you know, in case you needed to follow up with your participants. So, for example, this would include things like consent forms. You would absolutely want to hang on to those for some time after the length of the study, but probably not indefinitely. Yeah. So yeah, I think the answer, you can keep both, but yes, just make sure you use them appropriately.
That's really helpful, because I think these are, including for myself, some of the sort of real world problems that people and questions that people have. So thank you very much for such a sort of thorough sort of delve into the topic, Zosha. And we've been having a lot of positive feedback in the chat and thank yous as well. So just to relay all of those to you as well. To everyone that's still here, thank you very much for attending this session. We do have a short feedback form that Gara's shared in the chat. We'd be really grateful if you could fill that in. We will also be sharing the slides after the event, and the video recording will be made available within the next couple of weeks on the JGI website. One final thing from me, if you liked the session that was on today, then there's another session coming up tomorrow, which is a session called Sphere, collecting big data from family homes. That may be of interest to you. The sign up and event information is also in the chat now. But the only thing that remains to say, again, thank you, Zosha, very much for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you.